All right, good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you may find yourselves. We've got a good quorum of people here, so we're going to go ahead and get started on our webinar that will discuss opportunities for integrating electric and gas planning. My name is Jeff Deason. I work at Berkeley Lab. My colleague Natalie Mims-Frick is also on the webinar, and Mark LaBelle and Ronnie Sandoval from the Regulatory Assistance Project will be presenting the material on this webinar. They are the first authors on our report that just came out a couple of weeks ago. So this is a quick agenda on what we're going to discuss. We'll do a quick welcome and introductions. And then Mark and Ronnie will cover some background on electric and gas planning, some benefits and challenges of potentially integrating electric and gas planning, more so than they are in most jurisdictions today. We'll talk about some characteristics and indicators of what an integrated gas and electric planning system might look like, and then get to some implementation options for how to move that forward. Next slide, please, Mark. Just in terms of our process here today, you all are muted. If you have comments or questions, please use the Q&A box, not the chat function in the webinar. And the panelists will all see those questions, and I will be moderating question and answers at the end of the webinar. We will hold all questions till the end, and at that point we'll go back and forth for the time we have remaining and address as many questions as we can. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on Berkeley Lab's website in a few days. The link is here, and at that link, the report that is the basis for this webinar is already available there on the website, and you are free to peruse that at your leisure. And once we have posted the recording and the slides, we will send a link to everyone who is registered for the webinar. All right, today's speakers are Mark LaBelle and Ronnie Sandoval at the Regulatory Assistance Project. RAP probably needs little introduction to most of you, but RAP is an independent global non-governmental organization advocating policy innovation and thought leadership in the energy community, and a frequent partner on Berkeley Lab efforts. And Mark LaBelle, who will speak first, is a senior associate at the Regulatory Assistance Project, and his work includes a broad range of reforms to modernize regulation of electric and gas utilities. He has co-authored a number of major policy briefs and is the editor of a book on electric cost allocation. He holds a JD with honors from NYU School of Law and a bachelor's degree with honors in applied math with a focus in economics from Harvard College. Ronnie Sandoval is a managing principal at RAP, and he works with regulators and stakeholders to develop strategies and best practices to increase efficiency of electricity systems and maximize opportunities for a sustainable, affordable energy system. His experience includes distribution engineering, DERs, grid modernization, and customer engagement. Ronnie has a number of prior roles. He was business strategy manager at Accenture, a regulatory director at Vote Solar, president at ROS Energy Strategies, and a senior director of grid modernization at Environmental Defense Fund. He also worked at Con Edison for 12 years as an engineer and senior specialist. He currently serves as vice chair of the board of directors at the Interstate Renewable Energy Council, as well as on the board of advisors for Grid Lab. Ronnie holds a BS in mathematics from New York University, a Bachelor of Engineering from Stevens Institute of Technology, and an MBA from NYU School of Business. With that, I will hand it over to Mark to get us started.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And of course, thank you to our other co-author, Natalie Mims-Frick, everyone at LBNL, and everyone at the U.S. Department of Energy who sponsored this work. My name is Mark LaBelle. I'm a senior associate at a Regulatory Assistance Project, also known as RAP, just like Jeff said. So we are very excited to release this report and really appreciate you all being here with us today. I believe we are the first to tackle this subject broadly, but this will be the beginning of the conversation, and we look forward to engaging with everyone on these topics. The link to the report is in the chat. It can also be found here at the bottom of this slide. The focus of our report is on state jurisdictional issues, which centers in many jurisdictions around distribution level planning. However, in some jurisdictions, there are also links to integrated resource planning. There is a separate discussion around electric-gas integration for the purposes of electric bulk reliability and gas generation, and we do not focus on those issues in this report. Our key goal in writing this report was to create and present a long-term vision for successful integration of electric and gas planning. Of course, we recognize that it will certainly take time to get there, and many jurisdictions will take different paths. But you need to have some idea of where you're going in order to chart a course. The report is structured around 4 main sections. First, background on electric and gas planning is important to the topic for several reasons. The history of planning practices provides concepts that can be utilized in this new context, but also provides the baseline for further reforms. We recognize that jurisdictions are starting in different places, and certain capabilities for integrated planning may rely on prior implementation of separate electric or gas planning reforms. Second, we discuss the potential benefits and likely challenges of integrated planning. How can the implementation of integrated planning lead to improved real-world outcomes? And what are the limitations and barriers in current regulation that stand in the way? Third, we provide that long-term vision, which is structured as 4 broad characteristics of integrated electric and gas planning and 10 more specific indicators of progress across those 4 characteristics. Fourth, we present implementation options, examples and concepts for those 10 indicators of progress. In many cases, there's more than one option for an indicator, and I'm sure everyone will think of even more to add to this list. Last but not least, we also present some thoughts on short-term next steps in the conclusion of the report. Now, I'm sure everyone joining us today recognizes that utility planning requirements have been around for quite some time. Policymakers started paying serious attention to electric integrated resource planning, also called least cost planning at the time, in the 1980s. A related set of reforms around gas integrated resource planning was discussed in the 1990s and implemented in some jurisdictions. More recently, electric distribution planning has been a focus in many jurisdictions starting around 2010, and gas distribution planning has been a focus in some jurisdictions starting 5 or 6 years ago. It should be noted that integrated resource planning is much less relevant in some states today, particularly those that have fully restructured, although there are other levers those states have over certain kinds of generation decisions. While each of these types of planning has different contexts and features, there are many commonalities in the goals of improved planning processes. And these are often interrelated. We want to lower costs by ensuring cost-effective investment patterns and efficient levels of expenditures, both system O&M, but also customer-side programs. We want to sharpen our pencils to improve reliability and resilience. Stakeholders and regulators would like to have greater confidence in utility investment decisions, which ultimately should benefit utilities as well. We would like least cost compliance with public policies, such as environmental and public health requirements. Administrative burdens need to be reasonable on utilities, as well as commissions and stakeholders. And of course, costs need to be allocated fairly. Now, it's common to show the structure of planning processes in a flowchart with many different boxes, like this one. But it's worth considering the broader structure of these processes. We have inputs and modeling on the left. We have outputs, including an action plan, on the right. In the middle, there are different forms of quantitative analysis. In the specific context of an electric IRP, resource adequacy is a key criterion to evaluate. And at the bottom, stakeholder engagement is shown throughout the process. Now this flowchart shows key elements of electric distribution planning. There are several differences between this flowchart and the previous one, but again, we should think about the broader structure. There are inputs, such as forecasts and the bulk level electric system resources. There are outputs, including an action plan. This time, those are on the bottom. There's quantitative analysis of the system and its reliability. And on the bottom right here, there's a box for innovative sourcing with pricing, programs, and procurement. We've skipped over having similar charts for gas planning. But you can synthesize some shared features across these modern planning efforts, not all of which are always shown on the relevant flowcharts. First, many efforts include advanced forecasting and system modeling. This often means improved locational detail for load forecasting, improved customer technology adoption data, and up-to-date system modeling using that granular data, all of which is important to identify system needs correctly. Second, many states are working on disclosure of system needs and the value of alternatives. You need to understand these needs and the value of alternatives to scope solutions. Third, there are improved solution acquisition practices. Across all of these domains, traditional utility investments can be compared to programs, competitive procurements, and improved customer pricing options. Fourth, support for innovation is taking place across all of these areas. New system technologies and customer programs should be fully considered, including testing and scalable pilots. And then many jurisdictions are working on meaningful and equitable stakeholder participation. This means establishing processes for open dialogue, transparent information sharing, collaboration, and consensus building. How each of these gets implemented is a little different in each planning context, and no modern planning process has perfected any of these quite yet. These are all going to be works in progress. When we turn to integrated electric and gas planning, we really only have a few initial examples. We're in the green shoots phase. And this quote from an Eversource filing, a company that owns both electric and gas distribution assets, describes the status quo pretty well. Gas and electric utilities plan and operate their networks in parallel to one another, even when they are affiliated companies with a common parent company, because historically there has been little need for coordination. So then why should we consider changing the status quo planning processes and think about integration? There may have been some benefits from this all along, but one new factor is that electrification of heating end uses, switching from gas to electric, has simultaneous impacts on both systems. This direct correlation at scale is a link that has not been present before, at least in the past few decades. When we tackle integration, there are lots of potential benefits, and the categories are largely the same as previous efforts to improve planning. We want to think hard about improved affordability, better reliability, greater confidence in utility investment decisions, and least cost compliance with public policies. Ideally, we would also have streamlined administrative processes and more equitable cost allocation as well. When we start to think about how to execute integrated electric and gas planning, we have to deal with the reality of how electric and gas service territories are structured across the United States. Electric and gas service territories in most jurisdictions were shaped organically in the early to mid 20th century, and then more recently, there have been many mergers and sales. This figure shows three basic scenarios, although there are lots of other configurations out there. In case A, on the left, the electric and gas utility in an area are both owned by the same company. That's our simplest case. In case B, in the middle, there are two different electric utilities, and the gas utility service territory is split between those two utilities. There is shared ownership between the gas utility and one of the electric utilities. In case C, on the right, the gas utility service territory is served once again by two different electric utilities, but there is no common ownership among the utilities. So in these situations, what is the fundamental activity that we are trying to accomplish? What is the change we need to have successful integrated electric and gas planning? And Eversource helpfully put together this figure that demonstrates several key analytical linkages that we have adapted and used with their permission. Both sides of the planning system, both electric and gas, need to inform each other. On both sides, we have demand, system constraints, and reliability needs. We have modern procurement processes for non-pipeline alternatives on the gas side and non-wires alternatives on the electric side. We have physical modeling of each system, hydraulic analysis for gas, and power flow analysis for electric distribution. Well, this analysis doesn't necessarily need to happen simultaneously within one model. You need to have feedback loops across these systems. And to come up with coherent answers in an administratively achievable way, it is important to think through how to do this well. Perhaps that is obvious, but worth stating. So then what are the challenges we need to overcome to have successful integrated electric and gas planning? What are the barriers? We identified 4 in particular. First, siloed organizations and lack of visibility. When there are 2 different utilities operating in the same area, it may be obvious that each utility is generally not aware of the other's plans. But this may be the case even for co-owned utilities, which are sometimes operated totally independently under a parent corporation umbrella. Second, insufficient collaboration and stakeholder input. Stakeholders can be envisioned broadly in this case. For example, state and local government agencies likely have the best view on their own public policy requirements and initiatives. Third, it can be the case that different utilities use different inputs and modeling techniques as inputs to their planning processes. This can happen for completely innocuous reasons, but there are also good reasons to think that electric and gas utilities may have fundamentally different viewpoints on certain issues. And fourth, as I touched upon previously, it is not currently the case that electric and gas investment options are analyzed simultaneously with appropriate feedback across the 2 systems. Um, so with that, I'll hand it over to my colleague and co-author, Ronnie Sandoval, for discussion of our solutions.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks again, everyone, for joining. So for this portion of the presentation, I'd like to walk you through essentially 4 characteristics we have identified as critical to the integration of electric and gas planning. These characteristics help advance the goals of improved planning processes that Mark described a little bit earlier, including achieving lower cost and building greater confidence in the investment choices that we make. These characteristics also help to address the challenges that Mark just alluded to a little while ago, including the lack of transparency and visibility in assumptions and inputs, and also the incomplete analysis of the interactive effects that sometimes or have more prominently appeared across the electric and gas systems as of late. So in addition to each of these characteristics, we've identified a series of indicators that can help to serve to track essentially the progress across operationalizing these characteristics. These indicators can help to signal the extent to which the planning processes have been optimized to maximize the opportunities for integrating electric and gas planning. And you can see the 4 characteristics here, which include improved organization, communication, and collaboration, aligned inputs for forecasting and modeling, reformed analytical structure, and developing sufficient outputs for the procurement programs and other processes. So another way to think about this is that these characteristics reflect the foundation of the organization and planning that should be established at the outset. And these would also support the inputs, the changes to the analytical structure, and the outputs that are needed to drive some of these real world outcomes. And I'll, in the subsequent slides, I'll walk through each of these characteristics and their associated indicators again, so you can get a sense of how to potentially track progress if you're going in the right direction. Next slide, please. So beginning with this one, improved organization, communications, and collaboration. So this characteristic corresponds to a situation where gas and electric planners communicate efficiently and collaborate well with each other and with government entities and other stakeholders. Essentially, planners, policymakers, and solution providers receive the appropriate data in a timely and reasonable manner to make prudent investment decisions. The types of indicators, again, that demonstrate whether you're going in the right track or not. Specific to dual fuel utilities, there could be better integration across internal organizational silos where personnel is either reorganized or collaborative structures are put in place internally to encourage improved coordination across these fuels. For utilities, again, just building off of the models that Mark described, for utilities that are separately operated, gas and electric, more effective data could data sharing practices and processes could be established to provide a more seamless recurring data exchange and communication to help inform essentially consistency in the inputs and also potentially provide additional data sharing to governments and other select stakeholders. For the broad energy stakeholders that could be involved in these planning processes, policymakers and utilities can create dedicated forums specifically to explore the opportunities and considerations for integrating electric and gas planning. Next slide, please. And I won't run through all of these. We'll encourage you all to read the report, but some of the options that could be considered in the implementation and essentially operationalizing these characteristics can be listed here, including intentionally creating cross-functional teams at dual fuel utilities, creating these dedicated channels for communications and the transfer of data between external parties, including utilities that are single fuel in nature and other stakeholders, and also the formation of stakeholder collaboratives to essentially establish a cadence of communications and facilitate more constructive engagement in terms of essentially optimizing planning processes and harnessing the opportunities for integrated electric and gas planning. Next slide, please. So we talked a little bit about the structure first, but now I'm going to shift over to the inputs. So aligned inputs for forecasting and modeling. This characteristic reflects a process where planners use aligned inputs and create consistent forecasts and scenarios in order to properly reflect public policies and other priorities. The indicators for this characteristic include potentially a more centralized process that allows for forecasts across separate, disparate planning proceedings to reach more coordinated results. Again, addressing some of the challenges that we described earlier associated with inconsistent forecasts. Another indicator could include ensuring the use of best available data inputs and up-to-date modeling techniques to limit some of the duplicative analysis that could materialize through the operation of these planning silos and achieve more consistency across the issues that apply to multiple utilities within a jurisdiction. So, across the state, you might be able to, for all utilities involved, whether it's electric and gas, to have more consistency across the inputs that go into the planning processes. Next slide, please. So some of the options for implementing these characteristics could include new processes to coordinate forecasting on the front end, including joint forecasting collaboratives and proceedings. There should also be some consideration given to the applicable federal, state, and local priorities in a comprehensive way across the jurisdiction. And also there should be additional alignment that could be facilitated across the types of planning scenarios that are modeled, ensure that there's more sort of an apples to apples comparison, no matter if you're looking at a dual fuel utility or a single fuel utility within your jurisdiction. Next slide, please. So reformed analytical structure. Again, we talked a little bit about the foundation, the structural inputs, reforms that could be put in place for those. This focuses on the analytical structure and essentially how you process this information. So this characteristic reflects essentially refers to where utilities and commissions evaluate electric and gas system costs and impacts more comprehensively in planning proceedings that particularly impact both fuels and properly consider solutions across systems and non-utility resources. Some of the indicators of this characteristic in action could include more improved sequencing and coordination of utility filings, where proceeding order and cadence is adjusted to build on each other sequentially and ensure timely availability of cost estimates and other inputs in subsequent proceedings. So ensuring that information that's generated in one proceeding can more effectively inform decision-making in subsequent proceedings and potentially make adjustments to that sequencing in order to optimize results. Another indicator could include the joint assessment of electric and gas system impacts and costs. As various scenarios, investments, and program options are assessed, utilities across fields have the capability to optimize these costs across fields as well as advance other priorities. So you're able to essentially take advantage of greater visibility and transparency to develop more appropriate to optimize the costs that are incurred to support various priorities. Next slide, please. And again, some of the options for implementing this characteristic include optimizing the filing of single fuel utilities with overlapping service territories to manage stakeholder resources and improve the availability of timely information to improve decision-making. Another option could involve establishing collaboratives, including the potential for joint filings to ensure more consistency in information across the territory and improve the essentially the effectiveness of the analysis that is subsequently conducted. Next slide, please. And lastly now, shifting gears from the analytical process to the outputs, this characteristic describes the process for generating clear information to inform decisions fairly and efficiently. Utilities, commissions, and state agencies leverage these outputs to improve customer programs and other processes, including cost allocation and the development of affordability programs. The indicators that you see here that support this characteristic could include using the data obtained through the reformed analytical structure we just described to run more efficient procurements across fields and better tailor customer programs and other offerings. This reformed analysis could better account for the benefits across customers and inform cost recovery methods across fields. Lastly, the outputs of this analysis could better assess the interactive impacts of planning choices across customer classes and help identify additional customer programs that should be pursued in order to improve affordability and advance other local priorities. Next slide, please. So some options for you to consider in advancing essentially the outputs or improving the outputs as a result of this analytical process could include using the planning analysis to meet customer needs with better coordination of customer offerings across fields, including optimized investments, with better awareness of the cost drivers across these fields. Better allocation of costs can occur across these customer classes, as well as inform the program designs that should be pursued. Some options, including combined billing or just making information available in a more comprehensive way across these fields, could improve customer participation in program offerings from the utilities, as well as potentially inform the design of rate options that customers are presented, again, to align better with local priorities. Next slide, please. Again, we walked through a lot of the, some of the, how we characterize some of the opportunities for reforms and refinements in the last few slides. Here are a few just quick steps that you may be able to take in the near term to just assess the opportunities for integrating electric and gas planning a little bit better. So one of the things you can do is ask similar questions about the underlying inputs and assumptions that goes into the forecast across various planning proceedings, and try to get a sense of how consistent these forecasts are, how consistent the scenarios are that are being compared across proceedings, and just get a sense of whether or not there's an opportunity for refinement, and whether or not the investments that emerge from those proceedings are as informed as they can be. Another thing you can do is assess the sequencing of the filings and proceedings made across the electric and gas systems, and ensure that the information that is provided is developed and made available in a timely manner to inform decision making, particularly when there are various interactive effects, including on, for instance, the electrification of buildings. Another thing you can do is evaluate the level of consistency in how data is shared, the format in which that information is presented, in order to minimize frictions across the number of parties that would be making decisions, establishing positions, making decisions based on that data. One can also ask, is there a potential for structured exchanges to be put in place that could make the recurring sharing of this information more seamless, more transparent, and essentially help to build greater confidence in the sort of investment decisions, the program designs that could result from these joint planning processes. And a great way to start is potentially to initiate either an investigation, a docket, essentially get started on understanding what are the current capabilities of our existing planning systems, and try to understand which of the reforms that we've discussed should be explored. Don't need to explore all of them at the same time, or you can evaluate just based on your where you are, the current landscape, how best to explore refinements that would allow you to harness the opportunities in more integrated electric and gas planning activities. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, again, there's a lot more in our paper, but one of the things you could do at the outset, at the outset, we described sort of the evolution in the planning processes, and we actually view the integrated electric and gas planning process that we just described, including the characteristics, the indicators, the capabilities that we just described, as a continuation of that evolution of those efforts. The opportunities for the integration of electric and gas planning could result in in harnessing a number of benefits, including lowering costs for customers, and of course, building greater confidence among a number of stakeholders in the utility investment decisions that are made. We laid out a number of different models that are for electric and gas utilities that are available all across the country, and we recognize that one size doesn't fit all. While dual fuel utilities, because naturally they're under one corporate umbrella, may have some advantages in maybe exploring the synergies, the opportunities for collaboration, and optimizing the analytical process and the development of scenarios and other planning considerations. I think in the paper we've described ways in which no matter what your local structure might be, there are ways for you to get started and at least explore some of the opportunities for better integration and improve customer outcomes. So some of the small steps that we described here can also help situate your jurisdiction for long-term success, including those that help you just get started and assess the level of reforms, the options for reform that might be right for your jurisdiction. Next slide. And lastly, just as a reminder, we just provided an overview. It did not include all of the analysis that was present in our report. There's a lot of additional graphs, a more of a sort of a prioritization of which characteristics could be advanced further by certain actions. So you can get a sense of what you might want to pursue in terms of near-term actions to help you think through and also harness the opportunities for better integration of electric and gas planning considerations and impacts. But with that, maybe I'll pause here. I think that'll leave us some time for questions, but.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ronnie and Mark. We do have some time for questions, which is a good thing because we have a lot of questions. So I'm going to warn all of you from the start that we're not going to get to all of them, but we're just gonna kind of start going along and maybe combine a couple along the way to get as far as we can. So the first question I'm going to ask is from Quinn Weber. So we had discussed earlier on in the presentation, Mark, you were speaking about sort of some aligning forecasts and inputs and some sort of joint consideration of those things. Quinn's question is, to what degree is an iterative modeling approach necessary for an optimal solution to a gas and electric planning process? Is it enough to simply use common inputs? If not, what are the most critical feedback loops to account for in the modeling process? Not an easy question, but Mark, maybe I'll prompt you first.
Sure. So maybe if you consider the term inputs broadly enough, I would agree. But it's not just the price of customer end use technologies or demand patterns. It's also the cost of different investment options on the electric and gas system. So you can think about a very concrete example that we give in the paper is, it's not so much a hypothetical as something some states are thinking about, is if you're thinking about electrification as an answer to issues on the gas system, you need to know something about whether there's available electric capacity to serve that increased load. And if there's not, depending on the time frame, what is the cost of relevant electric system upgrades to accommodate that load? So you have these potential investments on either side of the system. Either you need to upgrade the gas system, or you can electrify some of those customers, and either electric system is ready and that's great, you can just go ahead and do it, or some type of electric system investment might be necessary to accommodate them. So comparing all of those costs and benefits requires you to know something about both systems, the customers, the amount of demand and load you're talking about, as well as the cost of the different types of upgrades. So you could have generic inputs for marginal costs for upgrades, but to the extent that you have like location specific costs of substation upgrades, that would be even better as an example. So that's the kind of thing I think would need to be explored, and how specific you can get in individual cases, I think would be an interesting discussion.
All right, I'm going to ask a related question, and again, Mark and Ronnie, feel free to either of you jump in. From John Lau about aligned inputs for forecasting. He says aligned inputs was identified as a characteristic of integrated planning. When gas and electric utilities disagree on inputs, such as the rate of electrification, who decides on what the right input is? Should it be the government, regulator, another organization?
Ronnie, you want to take that one?
Sure. So I think the observation, first of all, that there's a difference in what the forecasts are should be something notable in itself, right? The fact that there isn't that level of consistency across electric and gas utilities, is something notable. And I think initiating a dialogue in which, forecasts are usually within some, there is a boundary to which forecasts are developed. So there could be a whole range of possible future of different costs that inform the forecast that folks settle on. And I think just initiating a dialogue through these collaboratives and also through, just better information being provided, one can get a better sense of, how to better reconcile those forecasts rather than, sort of take them as face value, as essentially we have been doing through these silo processes. So I think the need for these reforms could help address that. But in terms of the decision making, that could be more of a jurisdiction by jurisdiction approach of who makes those decisions. But Mark, feel free to jump in.
So, well, yeah, I'm the annoying lawyer, but I think the answer has to be it's going to be up to the commission to sort through competing claims about what reasonable forecasts look like, and you could have bands of uncertainty around everything and encourage people to work through these things. But I think, like with many other issues, the buck does stop with the commission in many cases. But it is a team enterprise. I mean, everyone knows that NERC and the ISOs and everyone else that works on reliability issues have to be trusted, that they know what they're talking about, and commissions are willing to listen to key voices about what's necessary for the reliability of the system. So, as a legal matter, I think it's the commission that has the ultimate authority over what the right parameters are, but it really should be a team effort. So.
Yeah. And Mark and I debate a bunch about these issues, but one thing to point, of course, is that not every utility that we explored in this effort is an IOU and falls under the jurisdiction of a commission. So want to allow for different models and decision making that should be explored.
And I'll quickly also note the fact that, multiple scenarios can be helpful here as well. I mean, we're looking at an uncertain future, and it's not like everyone, in some cases you might want to explicitly consider those different perspectives and think about no regrets approaches in the face of that uncertainty. All right. Next question is from Kara Soller. I hope apologies to anyone if I misstate your name. And by the way, we are up to 35 questions, so you can calculate your odds if you've asked a question. But Kara says, do you have recommendations for encouraging electric utilities to share info with gas utilities? Our electric utilities seem preoccupied with data center load growth and aren't as concerned about residential load growth, so aren't inspired to respond to gas utility inquiries. How do we make this relevant to the electric utilities? Do we need commission direction or statutory direction to require data sharing?
So look, there's going to be absolutely a question of statutory authority in many jurisdictions, but ultimately, I think the procedural guidelines about information sharing will probably need to be laid out by the commissions at a high level. So there may be states where there's not authority to do this directly right away, but some commissions may already have sufficient leeway. So I think that's going to be a state-by-state inquiry.
Okay. This is slightly related from Josh Berman. He asks, for non-affiliated utilities, what incentives do they have to engage in efficient coordinated planning? What role does transparency play in ensuring that outcomes are efficient and beneficial for customers?
Right. So, I mean, so there's transparency there's several different aspects to this. In general, the utilities, to the extent they have incentives, they do want to follow commission orders while protecting the reliability and safety of the system. There's transparency for stakeholders, but you also need to get the right information to the corresponding utility for the analytical feedback loops that we talked about, right? So I think the key thing we talk about in the report is there may be different levels of information exchange for different entities. So between utilities, cybersecurity experts can weigh in on the details of this, but there may need to be more detailed information exchanges that are highly protected between utilities. There may be sort of a second level of information exchange between utilities and government agencies and certain parties that can sign non-disclosure agreements and protect the data. There may be sort of an intermediate level of data sharing for many purposes. And then certain data can just be shared with the public and posted online without any major concerns. So there's going to be a different role for each of those different types of information. With different levels of protection, most likely. So you need to think about which things have to go in which category. You don't want to disclose individual customer data publicly. You don't want to disclose anything that's going to put the system at risk. But there's not that many other hard and fast principles about this. And I think this is going to be the subject of needs to be worked out in more detail in individual jurisdictions.
All right. A specific and perhaps tricky question from an anonymous attendee. But what? I'm sorry, I've lost the question. Here we go. Some states have observed that their dual fuel utilities are forbidden from coordinating planning due to competitiveness concerns. Is there a recommendation for how to address this barrier?
So similar restrictions have been in place with certain types of programs, prohibitions against incentives that encourage fuel switching. And look, there were definitely good reasons for these things in the past. There are different pressures and different public policy imperatives in every era, and you do need to go back and look at some of those things and consider whether our present public policy needs mean that we should leave some of those older rules behind. Some of those older rules were there for good reason. I wouldn't encourage every single historical rule to be gotten rid of, but this is the kind of thing that always happens. You sort of see what's there and try to preserve the best of what we have and update what doesn't work to help improve the future.
All right. There are. This is a question from Joel Nightingale. Joel mentions that in the report we describe the potential for combined electric and gas procurements. When an electric utility issues an RFP, it may lay out the needs in terms of energy or peak. What would the description of need be in a combined gas electric procurement? And what maybe relatedly, what do we have in mind for what that type of combined procurement might look like?
So it would probably have to be in terms of the customer end uses. Unless it's a bulk system type of a thing, if it's a local set of needs, I think you have to define it in terms of making sure that customers have, as they say, hot showers and cold beers. Maybe beers is not the best example in this case, but it's really those customer end uses of making sure they have heating in the winter and cooling in the summer. And there's a variety of other energy services that are key here and can be served in different ways. I think there would have to be some work done to flesh that out a little more, but I think that's probably the direction.
Yeah. This is a question from Peter Savio. He says, it sounds as if a primary focus that we're considering here may be more project-specific instances, comparing electric versus gas infrastructure. If that's the case, do states that already consider non-pipes and non-wires alternatives already have this covered? Or is there a broader aim, which I take to mean is there, a component of this that is not project-specific? So for the project-specific, are there states that have already addressed this? And is there something beyond the project-specific that we're also talking about here?
I can jump in.
Yeah, please.
Mark, feel free to disagree. I think we're thinking beyond project specific. I think it's easier to make the connection when you're looking at specific projects. For example, if you're assessing the heating needs of a community and you are able to serve that either through electric and gas. And one of the things that we want to encourage is first recognition across electric and gas about the expanded customer options that exist when it comes to heating, and understand that essentially what those choices present in terms of potential refinements to the forecast that need to be made. If customers are gravitating to more electric uses, in terms of more electric appliances, in terms of providing heating, we'd like both electric and gas utilities to understand those dynamics and plan their forecasts accordingly. I think absolutely when you do have some of these projects that are more specific, more tangible, where you have a different investment strategies that could be pursued. You can look at non-wires alternatives, non-pipeline alternatives, as a whole suite of, and other options as a whole suite of solutions that could be considered to meet those needs. So I think just focusing on the customer, whether it's either project-based or the types of growth and changes that happen, and as the economy grows, as additional customer options are made, could inform the strategy beyond what might be possible at the project level. But Mark.
No, I think it's easiest to give examples that are at the project level, but and I think some of the things that states are talking about in terms of non-pipelines alternatives are good illustrations of project level considerations right now. I think what I do expect to happen is if people actually start to do this, they'll find new applications and that are not on our list yet, right? And just because it's the kind of thing that happens as you actually do the number crunching. I do think that states like New York that have non-wires alternatives and non-pipeline alternatives requirements on the books are figuring out some aspects of this. But I think there are questions, particularly where there's overlapping combined gas and electric utilities. But I think there's major questions in those jurisdictions about other parts of the state or where there's not necessarily a combined gas and electric utility, and there's more to do. So, I think we're in the green shoots phase of this, where there's some places that are starting to figure out some of the answers. We're trying to put together some of those puzzle pieces here, but I really do expect as people dig into it, you'll find new answers and applications as you go.
All right, we have 5 minutes, and I'm going to package a couple of questions in a couple of ways to try to, make it seem like we've done more than we have, perhaps. This next one is kind of relating to some details about the process for joint forecasting. Ethan Holmes says, regarding forecasting, my experience has been that gas forecasting is looking at the worst day ever experienced, a blizzard, versus electric forecasting of highest load in 10 years or something like that. How would you reconcile the different planning standards? A related question from Erica Aruja, how do the unique needs of gas versus electric systems get accommodated when aligning forecasts? For example, peak and supply side resources need different considerations for gas compared to electricity. So same same basic question. So how do you work across the sort of existing differences in planning conventions on the two systems?
So I mean, there are funny things about the 1 in 10 standard that's one incident every 10 years standard that's cited for electric reliability standards. That is less precise than you might actually think. And I think there's room on both sides to refine better reliability metrics for more precise value of lost load or other economic criteria for when do you stop making investments in it's no longer reasonable to spend money to ensure that last decimal point of guaranteed reliability. So, I think it's the kind of thing where there's room for improvement on both sides, and as you join it, you need to think about how to integrate it together. But I would suspect there's definitely room for improvement and further refinements on both sides in this particular case.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think this is where more coordination on the planning scenarios would be helpful. So it's not just one or the other that you're considering. You're looking at the impacts, what could go wrong across both the electric and gas system, and try to get a sense of have you sufficiently planned for the scenarios, ensuring that the capacity is there, that customers can still be served. So better coordination and planning, I think, could result in potentially more reliable and resilient system.
All right. I think we're gonna go for two more here. There are a couple of questions that deal with basically utility structure and the implications of that. So there's an anonymous question from an anonymous attendee asking about legal and regulatory challenges, if any, that you might anticipate with a coordinated planning effort if either utility is in a deregulated market. There's also a question from Dave Solos on thoughts on the case where a jurisdiction has a state-owned vertically integrated electric utility, but a privately owned gas distribution company, and how you can plan across. So how implications of kind of utility structure for the integrated planning efforts.
So for distribution level investments, for investor-owned utilities that are regulated by commissions, those investments are pretty clearly state jurisdictional for cost recovery and rate making purposes. So I don't think restructuring is going to impact those type of investments so much. There's clearly in some jurisdictions this will be limited to distribution level state jurisdictional issues because the bulk systems is regulated by FERC and a little bit less controlled by the state. So I think that's where you see the state federal jurisdictional distinctions matter.
Okay, and I'm going to put about 5 or 6 questions together and therefore not attribute them here at the end of basically people asking for kind of successful examples of state steps to move toward greater integration. And I'll use this definitely as a teaser for all of you to go take a look at the report, because there's a lot of specific references to steps that individual states are starting to take down this road. But I'll prompt Mark or Ronnie if there's if either of you have 1 or 2 things that you would highlight as examples here.
So look, I'll mention that there have been efforts for combined forecasting efforts across many states. Those combinations were generally for electric, but they show you a path for how to take in various viewpoints and different stakeholders and do joint forecasting efforts. So when you have to expand the scope of the analysis, it's a little bit different, but procedurally there are these examples of different pathways to do those kind of joint forecasting efforts. So
yeah, I'd encourage you all to read the report. Probably not enough time to go into them, but there are a number of notable, again, to Mark's points about we being in the green shoot stage, promising efforts in just getting a better sense of, what are the forecasts, the inputs, and building more consistency, even if not a full-fledged integrated electric and gas planning process.
All right. Well, and with that, we are a minute over time. So thank you so much, Mark and Ronnie, for this conversation. Thanks to, again, the 38 of you. I suppose a couple of you asked 2 questions, but who asked questions. Definitely was helpful engagement. And we did our best to get through as many as we could. Again, the recording of this webinar will be posted within a few days, as well as the slides. The report is already posted. You can scroll up to the top of the chat to see the link that Natalie posted. And we will follow up in a few days for all of you who have registered with the when we've posted the slides and the recording. Thanks so much for your engagement, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you so much.